Reefers.com. Milev is my initials of my name, Marc E. Levenson, and I have been doing this since 1997. We're going to talk about reef tank pests today, and this is a super long presentation, but Richard Ross told me to stop at 45 minutes no matter what slide I'm on. I'm just going to whip through these slides super duper fast. Well, not that fast. So when it comes to reef tank pests, there are lots of different things that can happen in your tank, and it usually comes down to the abundance of that critter. If you have one Vermetid snail, which you'll see here shortly, you don't care. But if you have thousands, it's a pest. It's a major deal. And that's happened to me with my own tank. So we're going to talk about some of the things that are commonly showing up in our tanks, and sometimes the things that people think are pests are actually innocent, and they're not that evil. So we've got a whole list of creatures here that we'll be going into, and I just want to start off with the most popular one, which is Aiptasia. Aiptasia has been around for a long time. It sneaks in on brand new tanks made with dry sand and dry rock, and you still have Aiptasia, and people just hate them and think that they're evil. I've seen them grow in abundance at public aquariums where the entire wall was covered. The whole wall was moving brown anemones. And the curator, Paula, told me, I hate those things, but the owner liked them because it made the wall look better than rock. And so they just had zillions and zillions. Now this right here is a majano, which is, a lot of times I've seen people identify them as Aiptasia majano. I'm like, no, they're two separate things. You cannot call them the same. That's like Snickers and Milky Way. They're not the same. When you grow too many of them, it can be problematic because now you've just got hundreds on the rock, and what they do is they sting the corals that you're trying to grow out, and they steal that territory, and there's no room for your, for example, SPS corals to enjoy it. And very few corals could hold up against majanos. Maybe mushrooms would work, possibly leathers, but the majority of corals will just be stung, or the life will be above while the majanos are below, but then the majanos will crawl up the coral because there's more territory to hold on to. So you may need some kind of a creature that can devour them, and the Klein butterfly is one that works. So this was actually a fish tank, that's a shot from a fish store, that had, I don't know, 10 million majanos and one Klein butterfly, and they never put food in the tank. They just said, eat those. And it was just slowly going through and eating everything off the rock, and then they'd take the rock out and put it into the tank and put a new rock in. Another choice is going to be the Bergia nudibranch. And the nudibranchs right here, you see a couple of parents, and then you see them laying eggs. They do that in that spiral coil. Those, there's a trick that you could possibly do, because if you buy adult Bergias and you put them in your reef tank, you might never see them again. And so one thing that I've heard that can work is you keep the parents breeding and making more little ones in a separate tank, and then you put the babies in the reef to go consume your Aiptasias. So that is one method. Now there's a lot of different choices you have when it comes to getting rid of some of these pests. And you know, we've got the copper band butterfly, we've got peppermint shrimp, and there's the injection method where people have used all kinds of stuff. And my very first MACNA I went to was in 2002, and I'm just walking through the corridor and someone says, I use muriatic acid. And I just stopped in my tracks. What are they talking about? And he was saying that he just injected them in the reef tank with muriatic acid. And I thought, well, that's insane. I would never do that. But I have tried things like vinegar, I've tried lemon juice, I've tried boiling water, and these things do work. But my favorite product on the market, it's been out now for a couple of years, is called Aiptasia, and F does not stand for Frank. It actually is the word you're thinking out loud. The boiling water is really good for the majanos. Majanos are just basically little tiny anemones that when they get filled with boiling water, they will turn into a bubble and just kind of pop off the rock, which is a great way to net them out of the system. Aiptasia is more a matter of scraping it off the rock if you're not going to use Aiptasia. I will tell you this, the way I use it is not how other people use it. First of all, you turn off all the flow in the tank, you apply the Aiptasia all over the anemone, and I do it like I'm frosting a cupcake, and I have a huge sweet tooth, so a lot of frosting. I completely cover it to where there's no animal left, and then I wait about an hour, and then I turn on the flow. And if white stuff starts flying through the tank, I turn off the flow immediately, and I wait another 30 minutes. And then I turn on the flow, and what has happened is that stuff you put on there turns rock hard, and inside of that hardened shell, it's got acid that's destroying what's underneath. And people have used Aiptasia for lots of things, not just Aiptasia and majanos, but it works really, really well. So I recommend it. Here's another one that people talk about all the time, the lowly Asterina starfish. I've actually only had a few that were problematic. Usually they do no harm in the tank. It really comes down to the color of them in natural light. If you look at them and they look kind of bluish, they're evil. And if they look whitish, grayish, greenish, then they're usually going to be okay in your tank. And I know that's subjective, but it is true. They reproduce by fission. They tear themselves in half and they start growing new arms. And eventually you have lots of them, and then they push out their stomachs and they're eating food off the glass, which is one of their methods. And then if you wanted something to get rid of them, you could use the harlequin shrimp. So the harlequin shrimp likes to eat starfish. It's the only thing it wants to eat. And if you put in a harlequin with 10,000 Asterinas, in a week or two you'll have 0 Asterinas. And then another week or two you'll have no harlequin shrimp. So it's really important that that shrimp immediately go to a tank that has more starfish, or you're going to have to start buying starfish to feed it. And that is one of those challenges. Another choice would be the Nardoa starfish that eats Asterinas. It just crawls on top, pushes the stomach out, devours it, and it's gone. See, I jumped ahead. Okay, bristle worms have been around forever. It's, there's very few of us that will ever see a fireworm in our tank, but bristle worms we come across all the time. And you may even see, after lights out late at night, you'll see one swimming through the water column. And it's only about 1/4 of an inch long, and it's just wriggling, like it's fireworks. It's crazy how it moves through the tank. You're like, what on earth was that? I've never seen anything like that flying around in my tank. And that's their juvenile stage before they start getting a little bit larger and moving down into the tank. And then after a while, you end up with something that looks like that, which is about 6 inches long in my tank. Sorry, it's a terrible shot, but here's a good shot. So I ended up getting quite a few. They're very thick, and these guys are rather large, and the bigger they get, the more hungry they're going to be. Now, initially, bristle worms are not really a pest per se. They are common detrivores. They eat detritus off the bottom of the tank. They can get blamed for the death of things. You see a beautiful fish you loved, and there's bristleworms on it, so clearly that bristleworm killed my fish. No, the fish died, and the bristleworms are doing their job. I have had things just evaporate from my tank because of the worm population, including a lionfish that I put in, and I went to a speaking engagement, and I came home 3 days later, 0 trace, not one spine, nothing in the tank, and the aquarium was 29 gallons. I mean, come on, how hard is it to find a missing fish? If you're trying to remove these, you would want to use tweezers, not your hands. And if you're reaching in the tank and you're touching the rock and you get stung, the simplest solution to the bristles is white vinegar. You just submerge the area, usually your thumbs or your fingertips, in some white vinegar for 5 minutes, and those bristles will completely dissolve, and then you won't have anything on you anymore. I know people talk about using duct tape and putting on there and peeling it off like you're tearing apart Velcro, but white vinegar just works so well, and you get 5 minutes to take a break. This pest right here is what I call the orange worm, and this guy showed up in my tank after lights out, and it moves like lightning when light hits it. It's called Onini fulgida, and it is a meat predator. It wants to eat your snails. It may want to eat clams. It's looking for meaty foods, and it's got this cute little face that you can kind of sort of see there. I wish I had so many more. I actually have an article about this on my website where you could see all the photographs. But it has the face of a platypus with cute little eyes, and it can stretch out super long, like up to 18 inches long, but it can retract down to a couple of inches. And like I said, when the light hits it, it's gone. Well, how does it move so fast? It's just a worm. Worms don't move quickly. This thing exudes some kind of a slippery mucus as it's stretching out. And it uses that mucus tube as a slip and slide to get away. So when something comes near it that it's fearful of, it will retract so rapidly. And so here I was working in my 280-gallon reef trying to catch these things with those long forceps, those tweezers, and I'm holding the flashlight over there, but the worm is here just to get enough light to see what I'm doing. And I'm reaching in with the tweezers, my hand's kind of shaking because I'm trying to catch this worm. And then I grab, and of course it's gone, and I have 3 grains of sand stuck between my tweezers. I'm like, ah. And so I had to wait again and again. But I worked admirably until I could remove it from my tank. And then I put it inside a little beaker and I was trying to take pictures of it, and it crawled out of the beaker and across the counter. And it didn't fall in the sink, it crawled into the sink. And I was still taking the ruler, taking pictures of it. If you're trying to capture it, you may have some tricks up your sleeve that are better than mine. One of the methods that I used, which worked, it's how I discovered they were in my tank in the first place. I took some glass jars that like jelly came in that are clean, and I'd put new snails in that and put those in my reef tank. And that's how I would acclimate brand new snails. So after they've gotten used to the water, I just put them in the jars, and I put the jars everywhere, and they just sit there all day. And then that night when the lights go out, they come out like popcorn. They just crawl up the sides of the glass and down the glass and into the reef. And here was this worm stretching from my rock work and just eating all the snails that were in a jar. I was like, wow, what are you? So I reached out to Ron Shemek, and he told me what it was called. And then he was suggesting, make sure that you get the head, because invariably when you're trying to catch these, you get the tail. And if you get the tail, it'll grow a new tail. But you get the head, you've stopped it. And he said, and if you found one, you have many. And I did find a few in my tank, but I haven't seen any in forever. But they're only visible after lights out, so you'd have to do some late night looking. The amphipod is a good guy usually. I know they've gotten kind of a bad rap with the zoanthid collectors. They say it's eating them, it's picking at them. I really think it's eating the mucus off the zoanthids more than trying to kill them, but I guess if a coral is irritated enough by something crawling on it, you could start losing some polyps. But personally, I've never in all these years lost anything to amphipods. And they're actually kind of pretty when you have a macro lens. This picture is from Joe from the 20,000 gallon reef. So this is some kind of weird, probably parasitic copepod. We don't know what it's called yet. So Joe calls it them. And let's see if this will work. So they are all over this thing in they're little tiny white dots. That is some Passilopora damicornis. See the little white things flying off? That's not sand. That's the bugs. They're jumping around like jumping spiders. And when you have these in your tank, they are just decimating your corals because they are so aggressively eating the things. And THEM stands for terrifying, hideous, eating machines. Right, Joe? So we got to come up with a name, right? So hopefully we'll get this identified. Joe used it in his 20,000 gallon reef. He went ahead and he got himself half a sugar packet of the drug and put that in 20,000 gallons and eliminated a lot of them. But unfortunately, they've reappeared recently, and he is seeing them doing damage in certain spots. So he is continuing to battle them.
Do you know if like any like the mandarin fish or anything like that would eat those?
They might do a little bit, but they can't keep up. And these guys they're really smart and alert, and yeah.
They're like that orange worm.
Biological control with fight fish and things, and yeah, they're evil.
Yeah, so he doesn't like them. Here's another one that I came across when I was at the fish store. Matter of fact, a lot of the pests in my pest presentation came from the fish store. I'd be down there with my camera like, oh, what's that? Let me take a picture. So you see these beautiful purple dots? They're not Acropora-eating flatworms, but they seem to be in the flatworm family. And I think, yeah, this is a video. So you see how it's crawling? That one there? I mean, maybe it has legs, but you can see how small they are. And they did a lot of damage in this store to the point that the fish store owner took all the corals out, took all the rock out, bleached all the rock, started completely fresh, put new corals in there, and made sure he cut away all the skeleton of the infection. And I think this is one more video. We just did that one, right? I think this is another one. See, they're right there at the base. And anyway, a year later, they were back in the tank, and he tore it down again, bleached all the rock. He says, I never want to see those again. I tried to figure out what these were called. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the information before this presentation because I didn't think of it till today. I was like, oh, I got to add these. But they were mentioned in Coral Magazine maybe 2 years ago. A year after I saw them at the fish store, I was like, oh my God, I know what those are. I have video of it. So you definitely don't want something like that in your tank. If you see these little, and it was funny because the first thing he said was, I have black bugs. And I'm looking at them and said, they're purple. At the very least, they're purple bugs, you know? And so that's the problem with common names, is that it's not accurate, and it's so vague, and it doesn't pertain. Fortunately, I've never had to deal with a Cerulid isopod, but these things here suck on the blood of your fish. And so when you're buying fish, you should always look at them in advance, obviously, unless you're getting them shipped to you. If you're buying online, you're just gonna have to see what happens. But when it arrives, you should inspect your fish on both sides and make sure that there's nothing on it before you put it in your reef tank, because if you put it in there and it's on the body of the fish and it's swimming around, they can jump off that fish and land on another fish, and you can end up with an infestation in your entire aquarium. What we want to do to get rid of them is get all the fish out of the reef tank itself, if that's where they came from. Get them out, let them move into a quarantine or hospital tank, deal with the eradication of that pest, and then when you've got nice clean fish, move them back into the tank and make sure you don't put in another fish that has it. Yes?
The milbomycin will nuke them also.
Oh, nice. The same sugar packet.
Yes. It's actually another reason why I use it. Just, it'll nuke them.
Thank you. That's great to know. So if I wanted to buy that sugar packet of the drug, how much money are we talking about?
Well,
I think it's really high, because he's getting the pure ingredient, where you'll see later in this presentation, I show the medication that we buy, and it's mixed with like beef flavor for dogs to eat the pill. Okay, so I mentioned remove the fish from the tank, leave the tank fallow for up to 6 months, make sure that you haven't seen any at all. And then there was a website, I think it's long gone, Reef Stewardship Foundation. I mean, look, this is back in 2007, but there was a website that dealt with this, and he did some different things. Like, he'd take the most foul food and put it in a bowl inside the aquarium. He'd cover the bowl with like some saran wrap or something and put a little slice in there and put it in the bottom of the tank, and the isopods would all swim in there. And then each morning he'd take out that bowl of the ones he caught. And he just kept doing that until he finally took out a bowl with none. He's like, okay, I've gotten them all out of the tank. Now, I can't talk about all the crabs we have, but I do want to mention a couple. This one here, the gorilla crab, is pretty famous for being a problem in reef tanks. We usually see it with its little red beady eyes. It looks super muscular, like Arnold. And we want to make sure that we don't allow it to live in your tank, because it could actually eat your fish. And I had one in my tank, and it kept, it was a small aquarium. It was my 29, and this guy was in the rock work, and he was in a spot I could not get. And he kept killing my fish. And I was like, I'm going to remove him. I'm going to get him out. And so I tried different things, and nothing worked. And so in the end, I took a fish net, and I ripped the net off the fish net frame, and I bent it into a spear. And when I saw where the crab went, I stabbed the hole, and I ground it around like I'm making pepper grounds. And I had little bits of crab going everywhere, and all my fish ate him, and I felt really, really good about that. This crab here I got from the fish store. I thought he was super cute. Frank was throwing it away like, oh, that's a pest. I'm like, oh no, Mike, why are you doing this? And I put it in my tank, and I watched it crawl up that SPS and just snip off polyp after polyp after polyp. I was like, he was right. So if you end up seeing something like this at the fish store, don't get it. They have bright blue eyes. They have black claws. They are sharp. And they're very hairy legs. These are, I don't know what they're called, but I do know you don't want it in your tank. So if you see something that looks like that, don't get it. And then if you see this one, take another picture, because it's awesome. I don't know anything about it. This guy here was in my 280-gallon reef. I'd never seen it. It was 5 inches across. And I was like, oh my God. And I was just on the side of my tank where you can't get, covered in coralline, and there he was showing up under the, I was like, what is that? And the funny thing is I never saw it again. I never saw a molt. And later on I had to take the tank down because it leaked, and I thought I'll find him because he's so big. I don't know what happened to that guy, but that was crazy. If you're trying to remove crabs from the tank, you could, if you're able to, using tweezers is one method. That giant one, that wouldn't have worked. You can sometimes remove the entire rock that the crab is on or in, and you could pour carbonated water into the hole, and it should come running out. You could try shaking the rock. I did that once, and it was a terrible disaster. I was visiting a fish store in Dallas, and they had just received a giant shipment of live rock. And there was this enormous crab inside the hole of this one rock. And I was like, I'm going to get it out. And I just shook it and shook it because I thought it would fall out the bottom into the trough over the water. And instead I destroyed it. You know, its shell was getting smashed and I killed it. And so we never got to see what it looked like. The final method of removing a errant crab that you don't want in your aquarium is to take a glass, like a drinking glass, a tall one, and set it in your tank at an angle with food at the bottom. And then in theory, during the night, the crab will go up the rockwork and he will climb into the glass and slide to the bottom and cannot get out. And you can remove the glass in the morning with your crab. This guy right here is a Pagarita crab. Usually comes in on Christmas tree rocks. It is not a pest. You should not kill it. It's super duper adorable. Here is one right here. And there's a Christmas tree worm right there. So you can kind of get a sense of scale. They typically, I don't know how it happens, how they end up on this rock. I don't know if they kill one Christmas tree worm to get that hole or if they just happen to bore in there. That I don't know. But they are filter feeders. And they put out these long, like antenna, and as the food lands on that antenna, they bring it down, they lick it off. And then, you know, they just keep, they're completely commensal, they don't do any harm, and they're super cool. And this guy here is a Trapezoia crab that only lives in Pasillipora. And I was at Reefapalooza, California, and this thing was on display, and I was like, oh, that's so pretty, I want one. And he's like, well, no problem, I just happen to have one here. But it would live in that coral. It doesn't hurt the coral itself, which is kind of cool. It's a good partner. Micro brittle stars are very common in the hobby. I had gotten a little tiny black one as a hitchhiker in my live rock, I believe, or inside a coral maybe, and you can barely make it out. But it was, the disc itself was maybe a ½ an inch across with the longer arms, and it kind of grew, but it didn't become the big giant brittle starfish we're so used to seeing. It was maybe 12 inches across tip to tip with the body in the center, maybe around 3/4 of an inch. And I really liked it. It was really cool, and it was very, very reclusive. You barely saw it. You might see an arm come out. And I remember one day I took it out of the tank, I took the coral out of the tank, and I'm holding it in the kitchen over the tile floor, and the coral's just dripping slime, and I'm trying to get pictures of the starfish. And then I put it back in the tank, and it just lived there. Flatworms, there's different kinds. This one right here, it's not actually doing any harm. It is eating the mucus off of that coral, and but it's ugly. So we don't want those in our aquarium because of it's spoiling the look. Now the nice thing is they're very easy to remove. Here are some on some candy cane coral. And I want to mention there was a lady that sent me an email, and she said, so I've got these polka dotted mushrooms and the spots move. And I was like, I got to see this. So I did find out, you know, it was definitely flatworms on there. And they can be removed very easily in a coral dip. You can blow them off with a turkey baster. But there's some flatworms that are a little bit more difficult. So I wanted to show you these as well. These down here are like little brown rust spots. Here's a slightly better picture. They're called red planaria. Here's an even better picture. And the reason I wanted you to see this picture, this is the one that matters. If you look at this part here, this is the head. See, it kind of makes like a cup. It moves this direction. This is the tail. And the tail has 3 points. If you see a flatworm in your tank with 3 points, it's almost always red planaria. That is basically their trait. And they are a nuisance. They can live in your refugium and you don't care. But if they decide to die as a group, they will take out your system. And there was a guy in our club who had a big infestation of red planaria in his refugium. The refugium was filled with zinnia because he didn't want to grow algae. He didn't want to have chetomorpha or caulerpa or one of those. He's like, I'm going to use zinnia as my nitrate control. And they had all these flatworms. Well, then one day, completely unrelated, the impeller in his protein skimmer split open, and the rust that happened in the water column made the zinnia die, which freaked out the flatworms, and the flatworms committed suicide, and it killed the entire reef tank just because it was all part of the ecosystem. And it was just one of those things, and if he had just gotten rid of the flatworms, his reef would not have been hurt. You know, it still would have been some toxicity from the magnet, but you would have discovered my skimmer's not working right, or things aren't looking right, and you'd start taking it apart and discover it. Now, the nice thing about red planaria is they're not hard to get rid of. So in this picture here, this is a frag of zoanthids that was purchased from the store. It was put in a bowl with some flatworm exit, and you can see the flatworms have all gotten like wrinkled up and dried out on the bottom. That's a very normal reaction. Flatworm exit is easy to buy. It's available everywhere. The only trick to knowing how much to use is to actually do a measurement of your own. So you've got these different choices for removal, but I want to tell you about the flatworm exit specifically because I've been warning people about it for a super long time. So let me tell you this story. When you have a tank filled with flatworms, the red planaria, and you're thinking, well, I see them and there's hundreds, then there are actually millions. Unfortunately, there's so many. And what I recommend is that you siphon out as many as you can that day and then look again the next day and they're all back. Like every single one you remove, they're all there exactly like it was the day before. It's like an army of more came out to take their position, and then you siphon them out, and the next day, still more. It's crazy. So you spend about 14 days siphoning them out daily, and here's my method of siphoning them out. You just take a mesh bag, so airline tubing, I took some rigid tubing, and I heated the end of the rigid tubing to make it pliable so I could bend it a little bit so I can get into crevices. And I would just take the bag and I put it in my sump, and I ran the tubing up to the top of the tank, and I would just siphon them out. And I bring my son over to help me spot the flatworms, because after a while you kind of get blind and you just don't see. And he's like, there's one, there's one, there's one. And you just keep siphoning. And what you want is you want to sneak up on them and you want to siphon them gently so they down the tube into the bag. No one's worse for wear. If you're aggressive and you're stabbing at them and you're like, oh, die, 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 they will start dying and splitting open and releasing ammonia in the system, which can cause havoc to your fish. So we want to carefully get them out. Now, if you don't want to use my method, which totally worked for me, you can do the exact same thing without the bag on the end and just have a 5-gallon bucket next to you, and you can siphon them out. And even if you're stabbing and killing them, it's going into a separate bucket, it's out of the system, you're not doing any damage. But really, you just want to carefully siphon them out, as many as you can, every single day for about 2 weeks, and then treat the tank with flatworm exit. Now, the recipe on the packaging tells you how much to use, but if you're not having any luck with it, you should take some flatworms and put them in a small container of water, maybe a gallon of water, and put in 1 drop and see if there's a reaction. And if there's not, put in a 2nd drop. And if it doesn't work, a 3rd drop. And then when you see them all wrinkling up, you're like, aha, 3 drops per gallon is my number that works for my flatworms. And then you can go ahead and you can treat the tank. Now, the other thing about using flatworm exit, it does not hurt your tank, but the dying flatworms do. I keep warning you about these flatworms. So what we want to do is we want to be completely prepared before we dose the tank. Siphoning every day is the first step. But on the day of actually treating the tank, you want to have plenty of new salt water ready. You want to have a reactor filled with brand new carbon, rinsed out, ready to plug in. And you will then go ahead and treat the tank. And then while they're starting to die, and it happens immediately, start siphoning out the dying flatworms if you can. And what I found is that as they're dying, they will do like a kite string going up in the tank, and there's flatworms connected to the string. It's the weirdest thing. And you're siphoning out the webs, and you're siphoning out all these ones that are dying just to get them out of the system as quickly as possible. After 15 minutes, start running carbon. No, change the water. Change the water in the tank, do a big water change, and then run the carbon immediately. This will protect your fish from being harmed. If you don't follow these steps, and you're just like, I did what the package says, or I put it in and I waited 3 days and nothing happens, like, what are you doing? Don't go with your own feelings. Follow the directions. And my website, I think it's miller'sreef.com/flatworms. I think that's the page. Just read that article. It'll tell you exactly how to use that product. If you see that type of flatworm, see, it only has 2 points, not 3 points on the tail. It's completely benign. Usually you see these for a few days and then you never see them again. So you do not have to be afraid of them. They will use that big round cup to scoot forward, hold onto the glass, and then their tail catches up, and then that's how they move through the tank. And these were living in my refugium. I thought they were cool. This guy here was not mine. Someone put it in a bucket on my front step of my house. When I came home, I'm like, what is this? And like, it's for your critter ID page. I'm like, okay. So I took some pictures. It's a huge flatworm. And this one here it looks like the mantle of a clam, and that is completely intentional because it will climb on top of the clam and just start eating the clam, and then you have an empty shell. And then it crawls away quietly, and it usually happens at night. And I don't know why it is, but they very often show up in big aquariums. You just don't come across these in a 29-gallon or 55-gallon, but you go buy yourself a 400-gallon, and all of a sudden you got, I don't know why, and they tend to live in the overflow box. Maybe that's their hidey hole, and then they come out and they wreak havoc. And not only are they eating clams, they're eating snails. And if you have snails that go in the overflow box, they will just go over it and they will eat the snail, and you'll have all these empty shells. You're like, that's so weird. Like, snails keep going in here to die. It's like, no, you have a giant flatworm. So here's a kind of a sense of scale. I put it on one of these plastic rulers. Here is the underside of it. And here it is in a 5-gallon bucket. So you can see that's about 4 or 5 inches long. It's not something you want in your tank. Now, to get rid of it, it's actually pretty easy. Just siphon it out. The trick is you need 1-inch tubing, and you got to work fast, because 1-inch tubing takes out a lot of water. And I remember when I saw it in this tank, I was like, okay, here we go. I've got a 5-gallon bucket, 1-inch tubing. I got about 19 seconds to do this, and before my bucket's overflowing from all the water coming out. And you may accidentally tear it during the siphoning process and have pieces. And when you look in your bucket where you drained it, all those pieces are moving. They're not all gonna live, but they still have weird life response-like looking reactions. But you know, if you break it into 5 pieces, you don't have 5 flatworms. That's what I'm trying to say. This right here is another type of pest for most hobbyists. They don't want them in their tank. They usually came in on live rock from Tampa Bay, saltwater. And the green ones are pretty common in Florida. Some people like them. Or if you get one and you can tell your club members, hey, I ended up with a mantis shrimp, who wants it? Some guy in the tank wants it. And they're gonna set up a tank just for this creature, and they're gonna feed it, and they're gonna love it, and they're gonna name it. For me, nope, don't need it in my tank. I also wanna mention that a lot of comments from hobbyists are that it breaks the tanks. It can shatter it, depending on if it's a spearer or if it's a smasher. I kind of think it's a myth. I have yet to meet one person or fish store that said, yep, see that shattered tank right there? That was the mantis shrimp we bought and it destroyed it. But people always say that story. It definitely has the ability to punch and break the shell of a snail to eat the meat inside. It can punch or stab at some kind of a crab, like an emerald crab or something, and eat the meat out of it. So, I mean, it's a predator. But the smaller ones really don't do much harm, but as they get bigger and hungrier, they will get more and more aggressive. This one here I call a good guy. It's a digitate hydroid. I don't have a better image of it, but what was coming out was like a white thread with these little feathery appendages, and it puts them out in a jerky sense and then pulls it back in, and then goes out and pulls in. And it was funny because I was doing this talk. I remember I had to ask, what is this, to Ron Shemek. And then one day we're at the club meeting, I'm doing the pest presentation, and I showed this picture and I said how it doesn't bother me. And I knew Ron said, it's bad, you have to get rid of it. But I never saw it do any damage in my tank. You know, I had 3 and they were just doing their thing. I was like, they're kind of cool, it's life, I like it. But he said specifically it could put out that appendage and irritate certain corals like leathers. So if you had a big leather and there's this weird damaged area and you have these things come out of the rock, you should put some glue over the holes to make sure it can't come out anymore and do any damage to your reef. How am I doing on time, Rich? Well, we only have 80 slides to go. Okay, so Montipora-eating nudibranchs. These right here are actually really problematic. And if you end up with them in your tank, we definitely want to remove them entirely. It's weird. I had a guy, again, a bucket on my front door of my house when I came home. There's this 5-gallon bucket. It's full of Montipora. I'm like, all right. And you know, no note, no message of who it came from. And it was filled with these nudibranchs, just filled. So I just happened to have a frag system that was set up that was empty, just filled with salt water. I was like, oh, I'll throw them in there. And I let them walk around in there and do their thing. And, you know, I was thinking, you know, I'll have to dip these corals or I'll have to rinse these corals or something, get rid of these pests. But the weirdest thing is I look at the bottom of the tank and the base of the tank was blue and their little white bodies were right there and they'd swim toward each other. And when they touched, babies appeared. It was just the, I know that sounds fake, but that's basically what I saw. I just saw constant proliferation, and I took all that Montipora that was given to me and I threw it all away. I didn't even bother. It just was not worth the trouble. If you see them, they're usually going to be on the margin of between life and death on the skeleton. So what they do is they lay their eggs right on the edge where the life begins. So as soon as they hatch, they can go get some coral tissue and eat it. That's how they live. And they grow and they get bigger and bigger. In this picture here, that's an adult right here. That's a Vermetid tube. All these are babies. So I thought, well, let me try and take a picture of this thing. And I grabbed this cute little tiny jelly jar, little itty bitty one like you get in a hotel. And I put it on top of another jelly jar, normal size, Bon Maman. And then I put that little floodlight there. So you're kind of getting a sense of scale here of how small this thing is. And then I backlit it so you can kind of see the body itself. Why are you seeing something different than I'm seeing? Oh, here we go. I was like, you don't see this slide. So this is what the creature looks like. And really the best method for getting rid of them is going to be cut away the area where they are and save the good healthy part and just start from that. So I was at a frag swap and I looked down, and right there at the bottom with this brand new coral, you get the thing that eats the coral, so you have to come back in a year and buy another coral from that same vendor. See what he does? It's intentional. I'm kidding. But we do want to make sure these don't get in your tank. So always inspect your new corals. You can look at them under different lighting spectrums. You can turn them over in your hand, of course. If you have a magnifying glass, use that. But you want to study it very carefully. Now, what I said about cutting away, you literally just cut a good piece of coral off, throw away the rest. That's what you do, and glue that in your, because Montipora grows back very quickly. There was a guy in our club who had an entire Montipora tank decimated by these nudibranchs, and he had to get rid of every piece of Montipora, and he waited a year or two, and then finally put in a new piece of Monty, and miraculously there was no nudibranchs anywhere, and he ended up having another pretty tank again. But it was his absolute favorite coral, but once they got in there, he could not have any in the system because it would keep them alive, because that is their food source. The barnacle, I consider it a good guy. It's just a filter feeder, it does no harm, but the people that collect torch corals hate these things. They're like, oh, it's destroying my torch is worth $600. And so they're in there burring it out and tearing it out. I don't think it's doing any harm. Do barnacle? Yeah, barnacle's not doing any harm. This thing right here is a fantastic picture of what looks like nothing in your eye. When you look in your tank, you see this little snowflake on the glass of your tank. They usually show up when you add live sand to your aquarium. It is a type of jellyfish that doesn't swim. It holds onto the glass and it lives very, very briefly. And the crazy thing is, I'd set up my brand new 400 gallon, I'd filled it up with sand, and then I put in a whole bunch of live sand, and about 3 days later, my glass was frosted with snow. It was so cool. And I took my cleaning magnet and I was, so I could see in the tank again. And it was like within minutes, it was covered again. I was like, wow. And then a few days later, they were just gone. I mean, it's a cool thing. They don't do any harm whatsoever, and they don't last very long. But they do come from live sand. So if someone tells you live sand is BS, that's not true. Here's proof of life. The stomatella is a slug that walks around in your tank. It has a shell on the top of its back that kind of looks like your thumbnail. People always say, what is that? It's good. It eats algae. It is a great grazer. They can breed in your tank and make more of themselves. They do come in a couple of different colors. I know specifically the one there on the left is kind of a grayish color, brown, tan. And then there's also a black one. Maybe there's others, but they are great to have. And if you look in your tank late at night, you might see some in your tank you never knew were there. And then these right here, man, they were so hard to photograph. They ran around so fast. I went to Ron and I was like, what is this? What's another bug? What is it? He said, it's a sand skater, nothing to worry about. I was like, okay, cool, because I didn't kill it. And that's the thing, a lot of times people will find something in their tank, they take a picture, they immediately flush it, then they ask everyone, what is it? Or they've murdered it in a dip, and then they're like, so what is it? And like, you shouldn't have killed that, it was fine. Sand skaters are good guys, but they move around like lightning, like they're just running everywhere. It's sort of like your crazy bug, Joe. And then this guy was walking up the glass at the fish store, and I was like, let me get my camera, and I came right back. So this is a nudibranch that actually eats star polyps. It looks like star polyps. And I remember there was a thread on Reef Central a long time ago where a guy said, yo, my star polyps are walking all over my tank. And we're like, we need to see this. And so he posted a picture and they were everywhere. And everyone in the thread was like, can I have some? Can I have some? Can I have some? Can I have some? Can I? Because no one wanted star polyps in their tank. They hated them. And if they could get nudibranchs that eat them, that would be amazing. He could have been rich if he had done it. So they're pretty small and they're intentionally that look to look like star polyps. But when they're crawling, they're obvious. But when they're in the coral, they're not obvious. If you were to blow off the coral with a turkey baster to kind of put some puffs of water, the coral closes up, but they can't close up. They'll be right there in plain sight. Speaking of nudibranchs, This gorgeous creature showed up in our forum on DFW Mass, my club, and I was like, oh my God, I want that so bad. And it's because it eats sun corals. It's so pretty. And I was like, yeah, that's awesome. And he goes, okay, come get it. And I was thinking, I got to drive an hour to Dallas to pick it up. And then I got to feed it sun corals the rest of my life. No, I'm not going to go get it. So I just used, because I really wanted a better picture, but I was like, forget it. So it just lived in his tank, and then I guess never heard from it again. If you do have to remove nudibranchs, the number one rule is do not smush it with your fingertip, because you could get poisoned. If you need to remove it, siphon it out, use tweezers to pluck it off the rock, but don't smash it. There was a guy who was working in an office. He had a cubicle. He had a little tank on his desk. He had a little nudibranch. He's on the phone selling paper to someone, and he just smushed it. Next thing you know, they're calling 911, and they're taking him out on a gurney because he had a reaction to the toxins. Vermetid snails make a hard tube, and they will put out a web every time food's in the water column. So if you put food in the tank, whatever food you want, whether it's frozen, dry, pellet, flake, liquid, suddenly this web comes out. And that is this animal's technique of eating. And if you are a heavy feeder, you could end up with lots of these guys in your tank. They can be very, very small, where the tube is, like 1/16 of an inch across, but long. Or they could be thicker around than your thumb. I remember I was at a tank somewhere, might have been Boston, I don't know, it was one of the clubs, and I was visiting some guy's home, and there was this huge tube, just giant, like 1-inch tube, just sitting there on the rock, completely empty, covered in coral, and I was like, what was that? He goes, oh yeah, I used to have a Vermetid. I was like, you had to take a spear to get that out of the tank. It was enormous. Now, if you're trying to remove it, you can break off the tube to make it shorter, and then you can put super glue gel on the end. You could put putty over it. The trick is to kind of trap the worm inside the tube so it withers away and dies. I've watched Rich do a video a long time ago where he was using dental tools and prying the entire tube off the rock, scraping. Just depends if you can get to it or not. And if you are feeding a lot of plankton-sized food in the tank, you could have many. Now, I've always had some in my tank. I've had some where it was like 2 or 3 and I didn't care. Currently, I probably have 100, which is kind of a problem. But there was a guy whose name was Hop. He lived in Denver, and he says, yeah, I've got a big problem with these things. I'm like, yeah, right, how bad could it be? And he posted pictures, and there was 1,000,000 in his tank, and there was nothing in the tank but rock and vermetids. There was no corals anywhere. I was shocked. And they also can live inside your plumbing. They can adhere to your return pump, and when you try to reach in the sump to remove it, you get stabbed by their sharp calcified tubes, and you're bleeding because you just tried to grab a porcupine. And you are going to have to be very cautious with them, but you need to scrape them all away and get rid of them. They actually are a problem in your aquarium, and you do want to remove as many as you possibly can. I know there's a technique using coral snow that's been working to reduce their population, because you put that in and they put out the feeding response and it's not food, and somehow it irritates them, and you keep doing this on a regular basis, you may lower your populations. That's another technique. The reason I mention is it will affect your check valves. A check valve is a piece of plumbing in your tubing of your drain system where the water's going down, and there's a flapper that opens and closes. Usually it's open all the time. Well, if vermetids start living around the rim of that check valve and they grow and they make better and better tubes, then the day when the power goes out and the flapper tries to come down, it can't come down completely, so your tank continues to drain water and your sump overflows because your check valve doesn't do its job. So you need to make sure you can remove check valves and clean them periodically, every few months, or you need to set up your plumbing in a way where it literally cannot overflow your sump, which would be using anti-siphon holes. But be aware, check valves can and will fail at some point. They're not guaranteed. Our next pest is a Pyramidellid snail, and they're very, very tiny. They look like serifs. Here you go. There's one in that guy's nose. And here it is in the mantle of a clam. And they burrow into the clam. They go right through the shell trying to get to the meat of the clam. So if you see them in your tank, and they're actually not hard to see. Here we go, one more picture. There they are. You can just flick them off with like a toothpick. It's not hard to, of course you have to get to the clam, but you want these off of your clam. Now this was at the fish store, and he removed it from the tank, knocked off all the little pests, and then you put it back in the tank, and like 3 months later, that clam looked so much better. It just literally got larger, and the mantle extended far further. A 6-line wrasse is one method that may work to eat them right off the shell, but it's so easy to remove them by hand, so I would just recommend that. Whelks are another pest that have gotten into our trade, unfortunately, because certain vendors through eBay and different sources was selling them as nacerious snails, and they're not nacerious. Nacerious is on the left, the whelk is on the right. The shell of the whelk kind of has a very specific look to me. It comes to more of a point, it's a little bit more elongated. It usually has these white patches on the shell, but specifically the snout that comes out, the trunk of the elephant, right? It's got like a tattoo mark on it where the other, the nacerious is just kind of a tan color. So if you see the tattoo markings around the snout, that would be an indicator that you're dealing with a whelk. Whelks eat meat. They eat your other snails. They could, as a matter of fact, they did eat a clam in my tank. The guy sent me a beautiful gold maxima. I put it in my tank. The next day it was filled with whelks. And he was furious because I killed it. He says, I would never have given you that clam if I had known this was going to happen. And I said, I didn't even know I had whelks until I put your clam in the tank. And so I spent the next couple of months going in my tank late at night with a flashlight, and I pulled out all these whelks and I threw them in the backyard into the lawn. I think they're still living there. But yeah, you can just remove them one by one. This guy here is called an orange ball anemone. It tends to live in the darker areas of your tank. It might be under the rock, it might be on the side of the rock, it might be on a coral or in a series of zoanthids like right here. But the thing is that they don't do any damage. They're actually in the anemone family. They're just a cool thing. I mean, they're just pretty. I like them a lot. I actually have a huge picture of one on my wall in my house. And they open up at night, and then they close during the daytime while the zoanthids are open. So it was really, completely, they got along fine. The white dots that you see growing on your PVC pipe or on the back of your tank, they're called spirorbid worms. They do no harm. People are always like, what are these white things? I don't like them. I'm like, just scrape them off, it's fine. But when you look at them, they're actually super duper pretty. And they are filter feeders. They have a little tiny feather duster type head that comes out to eat food. I'm not talking about the red one, I'm talking about all those white ones. Red bugs are another type of pest that have become a problem in our systems, but they're like one of the easiest ones to get rid of because of interceptor. And when they get on your coral, your coral looks like it has fleas. And it's funny that they're called red bugs because they're completely yellow. They should be called yellow bugs, but they have a red dot on their butt. Somehow they got called red bugs. So here they are on one of my SPS corals. Here's a close-up of some on the skeleton of a coral. Here's another coral that's miserable. Here's another coral with some on there right there in the center, and right at the very top, king of the mountain. So I bought some interceptor from my vet. I went to him, and here's the trick. Sometimes it's hard to get this. This is the same stuff Joe used in his tank that he gets in sugar packets. You tell the vet, I need this medication to kill fleas in my reef tank, and they're like, I'm sorry, I can't sell it to you because that's off-brand. You're like, okay, my dog's got these red bug fleas, and I need to kill them. And what they've told me, my vet said, look, if you want to get this, that's fine. Bring me a picture of your aquarium. I'm going to staple it to the patient sheet. I will sell you the product. It's really easy to use. You just take the tablet. You want the large tablets. You smash it under a spoon to turn it into powder. And then you can use it. Now, one tablet treats 400 gallons of water. So if you're doing a smaller tank, you would just take sections of that one pill you smashed. And what I used to have was a quarantine tank in my fish room that had it was like a 14-gallon tank, probably had about 10 gallons of water in it. I would take one of those spoons from the Salifert test kit, I'd take that and I'd put it in the tank every time I got a new coral and just let it have an interceptor bath. The nice thing about interceptor is that it dissipates in 12 hours. It doesn't build up a toxicity. It doesn't do something to your tank. It's super easy to use. Now, if you do put in your tank, you should rescue your invertebrates. So if you have shrimp like cleaner shrimp, blood shrimp, arrow crabs, hermit crabs, you can rescue them all out first before you put the interceptor in. You leave the skimmer off for overnight, basically for 12 hours, and then you just go on with your life. Turn things back on, that's it. And then you do it again a week later, and then you do it a third week, and now there's no more red bugs in your tank. All you had to do is put in some powder and let it happen overnight. It was fantastic. You didn't have to do big water changes. You didn't have to run carbon. You didn't have to install a UV or ozone or anything else. It's that easy. But the trick is getting the medication. So here's a coral that was completely shut down because of the red bugs. And once the red bugs were gone, it was completely fluffy and beautiful again. So your best choice would be get your hands on interceptor if at all possible. You could try coral dips, but it usually doesn't work too well. And my article is Red Bugs No More on my website if you guys wanted to read more about that. I'm just going to keep going, Rich. I'm sorry, I don't care about clocks.
I'm not the boss of you.
No one stopped me yet.
He's going on at 12:30.
Ah, we got so much time. Let's see, 33 slides to go. Isopods. So this one right here is kind of in the amphipod family, and they just walk on the glass. They kind of look straight like an ant, and they're nothing to worry about. And this guy here, you don't want in your tank. It turns out that word there, pycnogonid spider, is that right? They eat Acropora, and these were discovered a couple of years ago, a new pest in the trade. They kind of look like this, but that first picture was way more impressive. And then Acropora-eating flatworms was another pest that we did not like in our tanks, and unfortunately they've happened to many of us, including myself. They happened in Joe's 20,000 gallon reef. He was the one that taught me his trick of using fresh water to get them off the corals. And he would go in, and of course this tank is really, really big, being 30 feet long, so he gets in a scuba suit with a garden hose and waters his corals with RO water, and the flatworms peel off and blow into the water column, and the fish eat them. So I couldn't do that. I can't fit my tank with a scuba suit anyway. But I could take water and put in a syringe or in a turkey baster, or I could hook up a pump with like a maxi jet and some RO tubing and kind of flood the areas. So the trick is stop the flow in the tank, the coral in question, squirt water at it. It's going to do like that oil and water thing, or oil and vinegar, you know, where it doesn't quite mix. And the flatworms start peeling off immediately because they don't like this freshwater stuff. And then if you have a bunch of hungry lyre-tail anthias, they'll just eat them, which is so cool. And I had this working relationship with my anthias. She just sat there on the rock like a grouper, and she saw me coming with my stuff, and she saw me turn off the flow, and she waited, and I did the coral, and it came out, and she went gobble, and went right back to that spot and waited for the next one to come off. Then I was like, this water thing that Joe does, it's too hard. I don't like it. So I got myself a maxi jet with a super long power cord, you know, like a long extension cord, so I could just hold it in my hand and walk it through my 400-gallon reef, and I would just blow off the corals with that, and the anthias still was eating them as they came off. But those flatworms can hold on really tightly. I would hold the power head on one spot of an infected SPS, and it would be 20 seconds later, finally the flatworm flew off, and the anthias was ready to gobble it up. So if you're trying to remove these from the tank, there's a couple of techniques that can work. They also will lay eggs in the colony, not to mention they'll leave bite marks all over the skeleton. Let's get a better picture here. Those are all white bite marks, and that brown patchy area is about 10,000 eggs. So if you were like, well, I'm not going to sacrifice my coral, I'll scrape those eggs off one at a time, it's actually really hard to do. I've tried myself, and you know, if you leave one behind, you're going to have the problem again. So it really is best to just find a section of the coral that's not infested, save that, and like take away that chunk right there and just throw that away. It's just not worth the risk to your tank. Another thing to see the flatworms, if you can't see them easily because they're actually almost invisible, is you can take the coral out of the water and let the coral kind of dry off. And while you're in the sunlight, the flatworm will look shiny and wet. And you're like, aha, there's one right there. I do have them. That is my problem. And also, if you leave the coral out forever to die, you'll see the flatworms forever on that coral because they dry in that spot. And there's a sense of scale of a person's thumbnail next to the eggs, just to let you know what you're dealing with. So basically, quarantine all your new arrivals, and there are different coral dips you could try, but essentially you want to make sure you just don't have them on the coral at all. So if you're getting a new coral, you should always put it through a coral dip, and you should blow it off with a turkey baster from every angle, so that way we're blowing and knocking things off of it, and then when you put it in your tank, hopefully you won't end up with a plague later. Another type of critter that can get in your tank accidentally would be zoanthid-eating nudibranchs. They literally will take on the look of their zoanthids because as they eat the zoanthid, they become that color. They pull out the reds and put it into those appendages, and they just look like the coral. But if you were to blow the coral down like you did the star polyps and the coral shut down, that nudibranch will be very obvious and you can just siphon it out of the tank. And this one person here in this next slide found a whole bunch in their tank. And this is what their eggs look like on the side of a zoanthid polyp. So if you see these in the tank, that is a sign the nudibranch is in your tank somewhere doing damage and trying to make more of itself. You can use the green wrasse, the seagrass wrasse, to remove them. I wouldn't count on like a chorus wrasse or a 6-line necessarily to eat it. But really, the trick is watch, observe, remove any that you find. And they're not super hard to spot. And then this crazy thing also showed up in a reef tank in Las Vegas. And that was like an incredible picture. And then I found one and I was like, oh, I'm gonna take a better picture than that. And this was my picture. Not nearly as good. But that thing was crazy. And it definitely could be a predator in your tank on your SPS corals. And this one here was, I'm sorry, not SPS, zoanthids. It's a zoanthid spider. And here it is on the top of a zoanthid polyp, like a palithoa. The pally was closed. The spider was right on the top of the opening that would open up as a mouth, and it's injecting the babies inside there so that they can come out later. So if you were quarantining your pallies, you could see these spiders, and actually it's gonna take months to eliminate them. If you see some spiders, keep those corals in quarantine for maybe 90 days. You know, it could be a long time looking for spiders daily, removing any you find, and keep going till you find none. And when the tank is devoid of spiders for a good duration, then you can safely put them in your tank. This was funny. This I saw again at the fish store. I was like, dude, you've got sundial snails. Let me get my camera. And I came right back. And he was like, yeah, I saw those. I think they're kind of neat. I'm like, no, they're not good. They're not good guys at all. And again, they eat zoanthids. It's another one of those things. So here it is, hanging out with a quarter, trying to make change, and just doing its thing. So if you see them, just remove them, and they're not dangerous to you. We're almost done, Rich. The Scypha sponge is totally safe. People see them all the time. They're also called pineapple sponges. They may show up in your overflow box. They may show up on your equipment, your filtration in the sump, and they do no harm. They're absolutely safe. They're cool. If you are saying, well, they're ruining my view, I need to scrape some off, you can, but they're nothing to be fearful of. And now we're the part of the presentation where we talk about too much of a good thing. So, you know, you have these zoanthids, you're like, I like them, they're pretty. And they were kind of hanging out on my Maxima clam, and I was like, that's kind of neat the way it's doing that. And then a few days later, this is what happened to my clam. And I was like, whoa, okay, so that's a problem. So I reached into the tank to get the clam, and amazingly to me, I mean, I couldn't believe it, because I thought, okay, I have this real task. I gotta peel these things off. It's gonna be a real beating. They just came off like someone had sprayed the clam with oil. It was amazing. I just pulled the blanket off, put the clam back, and whoosh, it opened up completely. I was like, that was really, really neat. I didn't expect it. And then I had these really, really cool feather duster filter feeders in my tank, and they ended up getting everywhere. And I had so many. And this one guy came to my house and says, Mark, you can't take a single picture of this tank without one in the shot. There's no way. And he was right. It was literally like, it started to look like Halloween. Like it was kind of webby looking because of the brown tubes, which are soft and papery. And the feather dusters were everywhere. And it was just me feeding the crap out of my tank, and they were proliferating. And I'd reach in by the fistful and tear them out and throw them away. And I'd have more the next day. And I mean, they're cool though, but they didn't do any harm. But it's too much of a good thing. And then these here are nicknamed Texas trash pallies. I'm sorry, Texas, but they grow in abundance, and people really hate them. They start off like, oh, these are cool. And then like, oh my God, I have too many. So here are more corals that you can have too many of. Zinnia, Red Sea zinnia, star polyps, mushrooms. There's that clam, by the way, again. So you know, if you're getting these type of soft corals, they are going to fill in the area rapidly, and you may be doing things trying to get rid of them, scraping them, covering them with Aiptasia, injecting them with kalkwasser paste or something may work. Usually what I do when it comes to these types of corals, I scrape off the coral and then any remaining residue, any tissue, because if anything's left behind, I'm going to get more, and I don't want that. And then these things I think are gorgeous. Neomeris annulata. They're a calcified type of algae, but this guy in our club, he had 10,000 of them, and he was hating them. I'd have 5 in my tank, like, they're so pretty, why would you kill them? And he was showing his cleaning magnet completely covered. And he had a snail going at the glass that had all of them coming off the shell where it looked like an octopus walking on the glass. It was really, really cool, and I really wanted to go see the whole tank, but anyway, I think they're pretty. I think they add a really nice look to the tank, but they really soak up a lot of calcium, so they could be a problem if you have too many. Bryopsis is the type of algae we don't want in the tank. It's sort of like hair algae, except way more coarse. And if you're getting a bunch of this in your tank, it is a pest algae that we do want to remove because it can really cause some problems for your corals. And the trick to removing it, specifically the first thing you do is take a power head or a turkey baster and you blow out the bryopsis so all the trapped sediment in its foundation is gone. That will help starve the plant. I always say lower the phosphate level in the tank too, because the nutrients benefit the algae. And then you can try to scrape it away or pull it off, but it leaves some behind that will grow more. So what you do is you get yourself some lettuce nudibranchs and you carefully place those feathery animals on top and they will eat it away till it's gone. Caulerpa is something we know not to put in our aquariums. Matter of fact, it's outlawed in California. Almost done, Rich. Don't roll your eyes. And if you let the caulerpa grow out of control, you end up with a 29-gallon that looks like this. And that right there on the bottom of the big picture, that's a clam. And that picture on the upper right, that's a lobo. So I was at my friend Evan's house and we pulled all of it out, got it completely gone. And he was like, thanks so much for coming over. This was such a beating. I just didn't want to do it by myself. And then I contacted him like 2 months later, said, how's the tank doing? He goes, it's completely full again. I can't see anything. I was like, wow. So don't put caulerpa in your reef tank. And then this is a type of pest algae. It's called pink cotton candy algae. And the only thing that eats it is Mexican turbo snails. And then we've got different types of algae. Like this bottom one was given to me, like, here you go, it's a really cool red Graciolera. And then someone was next to, I was at a booth at MACNA in Houston, and next to me was an algae booth. And like, that is not what they said, do not put that in your tank. And if you break it, like, you know, you hold it and you break it, it breaks like glass. It makes lots of little pieces and they spread everywhere. So I took it to the trash can and got rid of it. I did not keep it. Maiden's hair is not really a problem. You can just pluck it off. It's kind of pretty. And then of course, cyanobacteria. I mean, it is a pest when it's red and ugly and bubbly, but cyanobacteria is actually totally normal in a reef tank when it's invisible. And it exists in saltwater, brackish, freshwater. It exists deep in the core of our earth in giant mantles of cyanobacteria, which is insane to me. And it does no harm, but when we see it and it turns red and it's making a blanket over the sand bed, people hate it. So, and our last slide, Rich, is sources. So if you want to learn more about pests, of course, reefkeeping.com is where this presentation got started. Mila's Reef has a creature ID section with all the details of each of these. Coral Magazine, that I'm the executive editor of, we always are talking about different things in the aquarium, so you can learn from that as well. Those are the things I have to say to you today, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.